first, we have Dr. Susanne Moser, who is the Director and Principal Researcher of Susanne Moser Research and Consulting in Santa Cruz, and a Social Science Research Fellow at Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment. Her work as an independent scholar and consultant focuses on adaptation to climate change, resilience, transformation, science policy interactions, and effective climate change communication. Dr. Moser is a geographer by training. She got her Ph.D. in '97 from Clark University, and she previously worked at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the Heinz Center in Washington, D.C., and the Union of Concerned Scientists. Susi is co-editor with Max Boykoff of an edited volume on successful adaptation to climate change, and with Lisa Dilling of a major anthology on climate change communication called Creating a Climate for Change, Communicating Climate Change and Facilitating Social Change, published in 2006 by Cambridge University Press. She contributed to the IPCC, the third U.S. National Climate Assessment, and other regional and state-based assessment. She is a fellow of the Aldo Leopold Leadership, Kavli Frontiers of Science, Donella Meadows Leadership, Google Science Communication, and Walton Sustainability Solutions Program. Please welcome Dr. Susanne Moser.
Let me just quickly switch presentations since that's not mine. I wouldn't know how to give it. This one up. Is there something I need to do here? There you go. Thank you, Kia, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. I was fully prepared to give you a speech of why a white privileged woman would be the first person to speak on a justice panel, but I was not prepared to speak after Einstein's being trashed. So I will just say that's an interesting place to start from as a scientist, and I had all kinds of questions for you about that. So anyway, I won't go there. We won't have that debate right now. But what I wanted to start with is actually a metaphor that Robert gave us, and that was the metaphor of streams coming together and joining. I was a physical geographer before I became a human geographer, and then wherever else I am now. But what I learned in physical geography is that when streams join, you must be in a delta, because that's the only place where there's slow enough to actually meander and meet each other. And when you're in a delta, the Greek letter for delta is a triangle, and it is the sign for change. So must be a good place to be. And I want to start out by encouraging you and inviting you into thinking in less dichotomous ways about science over here, or maybe I should put over here, and whatever else, about the changing consciousness that we've been thinking about, because all of us are rather complex beings and are in a moment of creativity and change, and so I would not call myself only a scientist. And to prove that, I will read you something that got into my inbox this morning from a dear friend who sent me this without knowing that I was going to be speaking here. It's a poem by a man I do not know, EQ, who said, "Everyday priests minutely examine the law," or you might say, scientists minutely examine the laws of nature and endlessly chant complicated sutras. For scientists, it might be equations. Before doing that, though, they should learn how to read the love letters sent by the wind and rain, the snow and moon. So, with that, I'm going to tell you about another meandering stream, and that is both a personal and I think a collective story. And that is the story of how justice, and climate came to be together in one phrase. And that is not a simple alignment, not an easy alignment. It is certainly my own journey, having grown up in a little town in Germany, where I think the first time I saw a person of color was when I came to the US when I was 16. I didn't see anybody that was in any way different than the people that I grew up with. I did know some poverty was on social welfare for a while, but by all means that was because my parents, both academics, were busy getting their dissertations and didn't get a paycheck. And then my mother was discriminated against as a woman with children, and so she couldn't find a job. That's why we had to live on food stamps. So I know a little bit about this, but for all intents and purposes, I am deeply privileged in all kinds of ways. So when I first discovered climate, it was this interpretation of just climate. It meant only climate. I looked at it through the lens of a physical scientist, right? Where you see a planet, you look at temperatures, you look at graphs like this that show the temperature changes since we've started measuring them with the kinds of things we just decried or heard decried, basically very simplistic methods, and yet the very things that allowed us to say about 150 or even more years ago to establish the basic physics about climate change. That was done 150 years ago or more, right? But at that time, we looked at it in this manner, and in fact, this is a kind of thing that only got enabled maybe 40 years ago, namely by the time we had satellites. Also, something that grew out of very simplistic Newtonian physics and so on. Anyway, no people. First IPCC assessment was about this big, and it consisted of only one volume, and it was only concerned with, is there a climate problem or not? It barely could say anything about, whether or not humans have anything to do with it, much less what it would mean to humans. Anyway, that's where we started. Then, just climate started to begin to get a different interpretation, namely the one that I would describe as looking at climate through a justice lens. And what I put here are sort of the fundamental buckets through which we, at that point, looked at it, which is that not everyone is equally responsible for the causes of climate change, for driving this. Those of us who are privileged, those of us who fly around the country, the world, those of us who are in high consumptive societies have a much greater role than the ones in low income, low affluence type of societies who have no access to technology that basically emits a lot of CO2. There's also a huge piece that grew at that time around not everyone will suffer the impacts in an equal manner. If you're rich and wealthy and can buffer yourself, if you have a secure job in a nice building with air conditioning, you're in a very different place than if you have to work the fields under the blazing sun and you have, under the pressure that you can't even take a break because you will not meet your quota of how many tomato boxes you picked at any one point. That type of issue around vulnerabilities or suffering the impacts. And then thirdly, there is also a very differential capacity to deal with it, both in terms of the capacity to reduce the causes of climate change. Many, many folks are compelled to work in the extractive industries that give them a job because that's where they are and that's where the extraction happens, and that's the only job they have at the moment, right? There are people who live on islands out in the Pacific who were the sacred sites, for example, I just put a site here of a cemetery. It's just being eaten away by the ocean, right? And they will lose their home. Some of us live on high ground, if you will, in both a real and metaphorical sense, and therefore have very different capacities to cope, adapt, transform, whatever you might say. So, and that kind of change in thinking is very well reflected by now in IPCC reports. The one that is by now the thickest is the one in the middle. It has 2 volumes where we make differentiations now around the different vulnerabilities that the world faces and different populations within it. And this is not only a matter of science. I just put up a slide here of people you may or may not know who play very large roles locally, nationally, and internationally that work for getting that kind of perspective into climate policy. So just to name them, Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, now has her own foundation and works for the rights of women around climate change in a way that, if we didn't have her, we would be in a much worse place. Taj James, a local person who runs the Movement Strategy Center, unbelievable a revolutionary thinker around the cultural changes, the mind shift that is required to address climate justice more fundamentally. Cindy Wiesner from the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, she's the national coordinator for the US in trying to bring people in the justice community together. Unbelievable woman. I recently had a chance to talk to her. It was really wonderful. Cristina Figueres, the executive director of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, who until recently, she's been fighting for getting justice into the policy arena just as much. So just want to say, you know, this is now not just a scientific issue, we're doing this elsewhere. Let me come to the third interpretation of just climate, and that is to think of climate as atmosphere. What is the space that we create in which we can address justice issues? And I'm not going to go into great detail on each, but there are many dimensions. Who gets to sit at the table? Whose voice counts? What are the processes that we set up? What are the capacities that we do or do not enable in people to be able at the table to have these discussions? What's the distribution of burden and income, very much like what I just laid out? Structural issues. Right now, this is our world, right? Where some of the privileged ones get to even stand on higher boxes to see what they want to see. And then there are the question of how do we change that? Equality would be if everyone got the same size box to stand on. Equity would be if we enabled everyone to have the same kind of view. A very different kind of thinking, but those require deep structural changes in the way we set up decision-making processes. So we're beginning to see a much deeper understanding of how deep-seated the injustices are in our world. And the transgenerational one I want to just put out, apparently Trump just asked the federal court under where this lawsuit of the children for a livable future, if he just asked them to stop that lawsuit. I don't think he has the power to do that, but that's what he just said is not a good idea to go forward with. Anyway, let me go to the last one, and this is kind of where we are right now, and where I myself, in fact, am struggling, and I think where all of us need to struggle at this point. And that is, there is no easy alignment between justice and climate. The focus on working for justice. There's a part of the community that fights for racial justice, for economic justice, for gender justice, for the rights of the LGBTQ, whatever, add your letters as far as you want to. All of that community wants justice. That is one spectrum who comes to the climate table, if you will, and for them, those concerns are as yet often primary. Not the whole community, but that is sort of where we've recently come to. Then there's on the other side, fights for clean air, for clean energy, for climate, for environmental protection. Often a very white, privileged part of the community that works on that. And now they come together, and the first time where they really came together is in September 14 for the climate march, where the slogan was, to change everything, we need everyone. It's a phenomenal change in thinking and in strategizing and in organizing for those communities to come together. And I would say, from what I've seen of that and my own place within that, there's no easy solution. One of the gentlemen that I've showed on that slide earlier, Taj James, basically says, and he's not the only one, many say this, but basically that the thinking that allowed us to degrade certain people and the environment is the same, it's the same kind of thinking underlying. It comes from the same kitchen, essentially. It is a deeply derogatory mindset about disconnection. And that is the thing that we now need to struggle with. And I would say that is by far a fight that we have won. I think under this administration we might see the coalition, that fragile alignment actually come apart, or maybe come more together, more forcefully together than ever before. It's an amazing opportunity. And so what I would think, what is the promise of that, from my perspective, is not only from a scientific perspective that we finally can overcome some of these artificial distinctions within the scientific community, between disciplines, between categories of disciplines that I listed here, that forces us actually to think much harder about the ethics of research, the role of science in society, the role of other knowledges, and how to bring together multiple ways of knowing, So we're going from science about to science for, from there to science with, from there to co-engage production of what I call socially robust, accessible knowledge, which is different than just another scientific report. It's socially robust. It works for all the people who were involved in the co-production process. And finally, it gets us to the really demanding place of critical self-reflection and the hard work of reconciliation across all the ways in which science and other institutions have been involved in creating and replicating injustices again and again in this world. So I think this is our chance, and it is very hard work. So with that, I'll open to questions, or do we do that later?
At the end.
Okay,
please.
great. Thank you very much.